The candles at Hartfield numbered in the hundreds, and every one of them seemed pointed at the woman standing just inside the ballroom door, in a gown she had not chosen, and gloves she had mended twice at the wrist. Eleanor Graves had not set foot in this house in 10 years. She had not expected to set foot in it again. The invitation had come addressed to Mrs. Dalton, her employer, and Eleanor's name had been added beneath it in a hand she did not recognize, a single line of ink that had rearranged the shape of her January entirely. The ballroom was as she remembered it, and worse. Garlands of holly and ivy wound through the chandeliers for the 12th night celebration, gilt chairs arranged along the walls, where the older women sat with their fans and their verdicts. The long table at the far end bearing the great frosted cake that would be cut at midnight. She knew this room the way a former resident knows a house that has been sold. Every corner was familiar. None of it belonged to her. Mrs. Dalton touched her elbow. "Stand up straight, Eleanor. You look as though you are attending your own funeral." Eleanor straightened. She had been Mrs. Dalton's companion for 8 years, and in those 8 years she had perfected the particular art of being present without being noticed, of standing close enough to be useful and far enough away to be invisible. She was good at it. She had needed to be. The Duke of Hartfield stood at the far end of the room beside the mantelpiece, one hand resting on the marble, the other holding a glass he had not yet raised to his mouth. Philip Ashworth, 33 years old, unmarried, the possessor of £12,000 a year, and a face that seemed carved from something harder than flesh. He was speaking to Lord Pemberton when his gaze moved across the room and found her. He did not smile. He did not nod. He did not lift his glass or shift his weight or do any of the things a host does when he recognizes a guest. He went still. The kind of stillness that begins in the jaw and travels downward through the shoulders and into the hand. And the glass in his hand did not move. And the conversation he had been holding with Lord Pemberton stopped mid-sentence. And for 3 full seconds the Duke of Hartfield looked at Eleanor Graves as though the rest of the room had simply ceased to exist. Then he looked away, lifted his glass, resumed his sentence. Eleanor's heart was beating so violently she was certain Mrs. Dalton could hear it through the silk of her borrowed sleeve. She pressed her hands flat against the sides of her gown and made herself breathe. 10 years. 10 years since she had stood in this ballroom as a gentleman's daughter with a place card bearing her name and a father alive in the next room, and a future she had been foolish enough to believe in. 10 years since the September morning, when everything she had assumed about her life had been proven wrong by a single letter, 3 lines long, delivered to the house on the hill, where she had already begun to think of herself as welcome. If you have found your way to Eleanor's story tonight, stay close. She had waited 10 years for this room, though she did not know it yet. She had been 18 when her father died. George Graves, a gentleman of modest estate, whose chief distinction had been his library and whose chief failure had been his trust in a land agent who borrowed against the property without his knowledge. The debts had surfaced within a week of the funeral. £2,000. The house, the furniture, the horses, the small collection of paintings her mother had chosen before Eleanor was born, all of it swallowed in a sequence of transactions she had been too young and too stunned to contest. By October of that year, she had nothing. By November she had a position, secured through the intervention of Mrs. Dalton's sister, who remembered Eleanor's mother and pitied what remained of the family she had left behind. 8 years as a companion. 8 years of fetching shawls and reading aloud, and sitting in the third-best chair at dinners, where her presence was tolerated, because Mrs. Dalton's rank demanded an attendant, and Eleanor's breeding made her a tolerable one. She had never complained. There had been no one to complain to, and complaint would have changed nothing. And there was a kind of dignity in performing her work well that she had decided early would be the only dignity available to her. Hartfield, though. Hartfield was different. Hartfield was the house where she had spent 3 Christmases as a girl, invited by Lady Ashworth, Philip's mother, when the families had still been on terms. She had danced in this ballroom at 17, partnered by Philip himself at the 12th night revels, his hand steady at her waist and his conversation quiet and serious in a way that had made her feel not young and silly and peripheral, as other partners made her feel, but real. Seen. Worth the effort of an honest sentence. And then his mother had decided otherwise. Augusta, Dowager Duchess of Hartfield, occupied the largest chair beside the fire, as though the entire room had been arranged for her comfort. 62 years old, white-haired, dressed in plum silk with garnets at her throat, and possessed of the particular authority that belongs to a woman who has managed a great household for 30 years and intends to manage it still. She had not acknowledged Eleanor's arrival. She had not needed to. The quality of her attention when Eleanor passed through the doorway had been precise and brief and total, the way a woman notes a stain on a tablecloth before summoning a servant to address it. "The companion," Augusta said, not quite low enough, to Miss Cecily Pemberton, who sat beside her with the composed confidence of a woman who had been told since girlhood that she was the correct shape for a duchess. "I had forgotten Mrs. Dalton would bring her. One does forget with girls of that sort. They are designed to be forgotten." Cecily Pemberton smiled and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Eleanor heard it. She was 3 chairs away, close enough that the words landed like a palm laid flat against her sternum, and her body registered the blow before her mind could organize a response. The heat rose in her face. Her fingers tightened on the fan she carried, a plain thing, ivory and linen, the only item she owned that had belonged to her mother. She did not turn. She did not allow her posture to change. 8 years of practice held her spine where it was. Across the room, Philip set down his glass. He had not been looking at his mother. He had not appeared to hear. His jaw, though, had shifted, a single small movement that someone who did not know his face might have missed entirely, and his hand on the mantelpiece had gone from resting to gripping in the space of the dowager's sentence. He said something to Lord Pemberton, and Lord Pemberton laughed, and Philip did not laugh. And the evening continued as though nothing had happened. The 12th night cake was cut at midnight by the dowager herself, a ceremony she performed with a silver knife, and the particular grandeur of a woman who understood that tradition was merely authority, wearing a different gown. The slices were passed on porcelain plates by liveried footmen, and the company ate with the cheerful anticipation of the game that followed, because baked into the cake was a single dried bean, and whoever found the bean would be crowned queen or king of the revels and would command the entertainment for the rest of the night. Eleanor took her slice because refusing it would have drawn more attention than accepting it. She ate carefully, the way she did everything in public, with precision and without excess, and when her teeth met something hard and round inside the dense sweetness of the cake, she stopped chewing and held very still. The bean sat on her tongue like a verdict. Mrs. Dalton noticed first. "Eleanor, you have it." The room turned, 40 faces, bright with candlelight and punch and the particular excited cruelty of a crowd that scents an entertainment it did not expect. Eleanor stood with the bean in her palm and the heat climbing her throat, because this was not a thing she could refuse, and this was not a thing she could survive gracefully. And the tradition demanded that the Duke, as host, crown the Queen himself. Philip crossed the room. He did not hurry. His stride was measured, unhurried, the walk of a man accustomed to crossing rooms while other people watched, and when he reached her, he held in his hands the paper crown that the kitchen had made for the occasion, gilded and absurd and too large for any real head. He looked at her. She looked at the crown. The distance between them was less than an arm's length, and she could smell the clean, cold scent of his coat, wool, and cedar, and beneath it something warmer that she remembered from a decade ago and had never once permitted herself to think about since. Miss Graves. His voice was low, level, the voice of a man stating a fact rather than performing a ritual. He set the crown on her head. His fingers brushed her hair. The touch lasted no more than a breath, and her whole body registered it, heat rushing from the point of contact down through her shoulders and into her hands, and she gripped the fan so hard the ivory creaked. "Sit," he said. "You are the queen tonight. No one will trouble you." The words were a command. Eleanor heard only the authority in them, the same clipped control she remembered from his letters before the letters stopped. She did not hear what Mrs. Dalton heard, which was the slight drop in his voice on the word trouble, or what the footman standing nearest heard, which was the way the Duke had positioned himself between Miss Graves and the Dowager's chair, without once looking in his mother's direction. She sat. The crown was too large and slipped slightly to the left. She did not adjust it. Augusta's fan snapped open. One sharp motion, the sound of it like a book closed too hard, and she turned to Lord Pemberton and said something quiet that made him nod and glance toward Eleanor with the particular expression of a man confirming that an inconvenience has been noted. The revels continued. Eleanor, as queen, was required to name the games, and she chose them carefully, small familiar things that would not draw attention back to her. Charades, a round of forfeits, a recitation contest. She managed each with quiet competence, and if her voice trembled once at the start, it steadied within a sentence. And the company, having expected awkwardness from the companion, found instead a woman who could hold a room's attention without raising her voice, and who chose her words with the precision of someone who had spent a long time listening to other people choose theirs. Badly. Philip watched from beside the mantelpiece. His face gave nothing. His body, though, had shifted its orientation by 3 degrees, enough that he was no longer facing Lord Pemberton squarely, and was instead angled toward the center of the room, where Eleanor stood with her absurd gilt crown listing over one ear and her composure intact, and her voice carrying the steady warmth of a woman who had forgotten she possessed it. He watched her the way a man watches a fire when he has been cold for a long time and does not yet trust himself to step closer. Then the forfeits game produced a commotion near the servants' door, and in the noise of it a young girl of perhaps 9 years old, the daughter of one of the tenant farmers invited for the 12th night tradition, began to cry. The child had spilled punch on her dress, a blue cotton frock that was clearly the best thing she owned, and the stain had spread across the bodice like a wound, and the girl stood frozen in the particular agony of a child who knows she has ruined the one fine thing she was given. Eleanor was beside her before the footman could arrive. She knelt on the cold stone floor in her borrowed gown without a flicker of hesitation, her knees meeting the chill through the thin fabric, and produced a handkerchief from her sleeve, dampened it from the water jug on the nearest sideboard, and began to work at the stain with small, careful motions. The girl's chin was trembling. Eleanor cupped it gently with her free hand. "It will come out," she said, her voice low and certain. "Punch is nothing. My mother once spilled an entire decanter of claret on her wedding dress and wore it to church the following Sunday, and no one was any the wiser." The girl's eyes widened. "Truly?" "Truly. She said the dress looked better for it, called it character." The girl laughed through her tears, a high, surprised sound, and Eleanor smoothed the damp cloth across the bodice one final time and inspected her work. The stain had faded to a shadow. "There," Eleanor said. "You see? Character." She smiled at her, a real smile, unguarded and warm, the kind of smile that belonged to the woman she had been before the debts and the silence and the 8 years of third-best chairs. The girl reached out and touched the paper crown still listing on Eleanor's head, and Eleanor laughed, and the sound of her own laughter startled her, because it had been a very long time since she had heard it. Philip stood in the doorway. He had followed the commotion, or perhaps he had followed her. His hand was on the doorframe, and his face, for the first time that evening, was not composed. Something had cracked in it, a fault line running from his eyes to his mouth, and he stood perfectly still and watched a woman in a borrowed gown kneel on a stone floor and make a child laugh, and the crack in his face deepened until it looked less like composure breaking and more like a man remembering something he had spent 10 years trying to forget. He turned away before she looked up. She did not see him there. He had counted on that. The evening's second act belonged to the Dowager. Augusta waited until the company had resettled, until the musicians had begun a slow air and the punch had been refreshed and the crowd's attention had softened into the comfortable haze of a late evening. And then she stood and addressed the room with the authority of a woman who had been addressing rooms for 3 decades. "I am told," she said, her voice carrying easily across the ballroom, "that Mrs. Dalton's companion has acquitted herself admirably as our queen of the revels." She paused. The compliment landed. Then the cut. It is always a pleasure to see a young woman of diminished circumstances find a role in which she can be of some small use. "Miss Graves, we are grateful for your service." The word service landed exactly where Augusta intended it. Not companionship. Not presence. Service. The word of a woman who scrubs floors and carries trays and exists at the pleasure of someone with the means to dismiss her. The room heard it. Every woman in the gilt chairs heard the distinction, and several of them adjusted their posture in the way people do when they wish to signal that they are not the person being addressed. Eleanor's hands were in her lap. The fan was still. Her face showed nothing, and her body held its posture as though it had been built to withstand exactly this, and perhaps it had, because this was not the first time, and would not be the last, and the only thing she could protect in this room was the manner of her bearing it. Miss Pemberton stood beside the Dowager, like a woman arranged for a portrait. Her gown was cream silk with seed pearls at the bodice. Her hair was dressed with tiny white flowers. She was beautiful in the particular way that the correct choice is always beautiful, polished and symmetrical, and so obviously right that the very rightness of her made Eleanor feel not wrong, exactly, but unnecessary. A draft in a room that had already been warmed. Philip spoke. "Miss Pemberton, Lord Pemberton, your carriage will be called whenever you wish. The snow is thickening." The sentence was addressed to the room at large, perfectly courteous, perfectly empty, and it accomplished the single thing it needed to accomplish, which was to move the evening's attention from Eleanor to the question of departures. Eleanor exhaled. She was not certain he had done it deliberately. She was not certain of anything about him anymore. Later, when the room had thinned, and the musicians were packing their instruments, and the servants were clearing the last of the cake, Eleanor found herself alone in the small library adjacent to the ballroom, the room where, 10 years ago, Philip's father had kept his collection of maps, and his wife had kept a shelf of poetry, and Eleanor had once spent an entire December afternoon reading by the window, while snow fell outside, and the future had seemed like something she could reach out and touch. The shelf of poetry was still there. The volumes were older now. Their spines cracked and faded, and Eleanor ran her fingers along them with the careful reverence of a woman touching something that belonged to a version of herself she could no longer afford. She pulled one free, a slim green volume of verse. She opened it, and a piece of paper fell from between the pages and landed on the carpet at her feet. A dance card. Yellowed with age, folded once along the center, the ink faded to the color of weak tea. She picked it up and unfolded it, and her name was written in every line. Eleanor Graves. Eleanor Graves. Eleanor Graves. In Philip's handwriting. The 12th night ball, 10 years ago. He had kept it. She was still holding it when the door opened. Philip stood in the entrance, and for a moment the two of them occupied the small library like two people who had wandered into a room that belonged to someone they used to know. And the silence between them was 10 years long, and it filled every corner, and it pressed against the windows where the snow was falling, and it was the heaviest thing in the house. "You kept this," she said. She held up the dance card. Her voice did not tremble, and she was proud of that. He looked at the card in her hand. Something moved behind his eyes, a door opening and closing very quickly, and then his face was composed again. "It was in the book. I did not remove it. Every line. You wrote my name in every line. I remember. If you have stayed with Eleanor this far, stay a little longer." The night was not finished with either of them. She searched his face for something she could trust, some crack in the stone that would tell her what the dance card meant, and what his stillness in the ballroom had meant, and why, after 10 years of absolute silence, her name had been added to Mrs. Dalton's invitation in a hand she did not recognize. She found nothing. His face was closed, disciplined, the face of a man who had practiced not feeling things in public until the practice had become the truth. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was what had happened in the September, after her father's death. Philip had written to her 3 letters, each one more direct than the last, each one asking her to come to Hartfield, to allow him to help, to permit him to act before the creditors finished what they had begun. He had not used the word love. He had used the words duty and care, and the phrase "I would consider it a privilege," which, for Philip Ashworth at 23, had been as close to a declaration as his upbringing permitted. He had sent the letters through his mother's household because the post from Hartfield ran through the dowager's steward, and he had not thought to question whether they would arrive. They had not arrived. Augusta had read them, folded them back into their seals, and placed them in the fire one by one, and in their place she had sent a single letter to Philip, delivered to his rooms at the London house in September, written in a feminine hand he did not recognize, informing him that Miss Graves had accepted an offer of marriage from a gentleman in Dorset, and wished his grace well. The letter was 3 lines long. Philip had read it once, placed it in the drawer of his writing desk, and not spoken Eleanor's name aloud for 10 years. He had not married. He had not courted. He had attended the season 3 times in the years that followed, each time at his mother's insistence, and each time he had stood at the edge of the ballroom with a glass he did not drink, and a face that discouraged conversation, and the debutantes had approached, and the debutantes had retreated, and his mother had presented Miss Pemberton, and Miss Lacy, and Lady Charlotte Holt, and a procession of suitable women whose suitability had registered on him like weather observed through glass. He had taken up the management of the estate with the grim efficiency of a man converting grief into labor, and the county had called him cold, and the season had called him proud, and his mother had called him sensible, and none of them had been correct. He had been a man holding a door shut against a room he could not enter, and the door had held, and the room had stayed dark. and the 10 years had passed the way a winter passes when no one is counting the days. "You should not be in here alone," he said. "Come, I will walk you back to the ballroom." His hand was at her elbow, and the contact, even through the fabric of her sleeve, sent a line of heat from her arm to her ribs, and she drew a breath that she hoped he did not hear, and that he absolutely heard, because his fingers tightened for a fraction of a second before releasing, and they walked back to the ballroom in silence, and the silence was no longer empty. It was full. In the ballroom, the last of the guests were collecting their wraps. Lord Pemberton stood near the door with his daughter, and as Eleanor passed, he leaned toward his wife and said, low enough that only the nearest chairs could hear, and loud enough that Eleanor was among them, "The dowager tells me the companion girl has nothing, not a penny. Her father left debts, and she has been living on Mrs. Dalton's charity since. One does wonder why Hartfield invited her at all. 3 times now. The private aside, the public address, and now the witnessed report. 3 rooms, 3 voices. The same verdict delivered in 3 different registers, and each one landing in Eleanor's chest like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples widening until her entire body felt the weight of what this world had decided she was. She did not stop walking. She did not turn. Her chin remained level, and her step remained steady. And if her eyes were brighter than they had been a moment before, the candlelight was kind enough to hide it. The snow had thickened outside the windows, and the carriages were being called, and the evening should have ended there in the quiet diminishment of a woman collecting her employer's shawl and stepping back into the shadows where the world had placed her. It would have ended there had Augusta not chosen this moment to make her final move. The dowager stood. The room, by habit, attended. "Before the evening closes," she said, and her voice had the ceremonial weight of a woman who has rehearsed a moment until it gleams, "I wish to share a happiness. My son, the Duke of Hartfield, will announce his engagement to Miss Cecily Pemberton before Candlemas. The families have been in conversation for some months, and I am pleased to say that the match is everything a mother could wish." The room murmured its approval. Miss Pemberton lowered her eyes with practiced modesty. Lord Pemberton inclined his head. Philip stood beside the mantelpiece, and his hand, which had been resting on the marble, went rigid, and his face, which had been composed, did something Eleanor had never seen it do in all the years she had known him. It emptied. Not anger, not shock, something worse. The blankness of a man whose decisions have been made for him by a woman who has always believed she had the right. Augusta turned to Eleanor. "Miss Graves, I trust you will offer your congratulations. It is always gracious when those who have benefited from a household's generosity acknowledge the household's joy." The room was watching. Every face turned toward Eleanor, with the particular avidity of a crowd that recognizes it is witnessing something that will be discussed for weeks. Eleanor stood very still. Her hand was on Mrs. Dalton's shawl. The fan was in her other hand. Her heart was beating in her throat, and her eyes were dry, and the 10 years of silence pressed against her ribs like a hand held flat against a closing door. She could have curtsied. She could have murmured her congratulations and collected her coat and walked out into the snow and returned to Mrs. Dalton's house and resumed the life that the world had assigned her, the third best chair and the borrowed gown and the slow, steady erasure of everything she had once believed herself to be. She could have done that. It would have been the safe thing. It would have been the thing every year of her life since 18 had trained her to do. The accommodation, the retreat, the small surrender that costs nothing visible and costs everything that matters. She did not do the safe thing. "Your Grace," Eleanor said, and her voice was steady, and her voice was clear, and it carried across the ballroom to the gilt chairs and the garlands, and the last of the candles guttering in their holders. I wish the Duke every happiness. I will say, because I may not have another occasion to say it, that I came here tonight because I was asked, and I did not know what I would find. And what I have found is that 10 years is long enough to carry a silence that was never mine to carry. I do not ask for anything. I never did. The room was quiet. Eleanor's voice had not risen. It had not broken. It had simply told the truth in a room full of people who had built their evening around the assumption that she would not. Mrs. Dalton's hand had risen to her throat. A woman in the second row of gilt chairs, someone Eleanor did not know, pressed her lips together and looked away. The silence that followed Eleanor's words was the kind that changes the temperature of a room, the kind that makes people aware of their own posture and the weight of what they have permitted to happen in their presence. Philip moved. The movement began in his shoulders, a straightening that was almost imperceptible, and traveled down through his arms to his hands, and the glass he had been holding was set down on the mantelpiece with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence, and he turned to face his mother, and his face was no longer empty. It was full of something old and heavy and precise. There will be no engagement to Miss Pemberton. 7 words. They landed in the silence the way a stone lands in a frozen pond, and the ice cracked outward from the point of impact, and the room heard it. Every person in the room heard it, and Augusta's face, which had been arranged in the confident architecture of a woman whose plans have never been seriously opposed, went white. Philip. Her voice was sharp. This is not the moment. There has never been a conversation with the Pembertons about an engagement. There has never been an understanding. You have announced a fiction, Mother, and I will not permit it to stand. He turned, crossed the room. Not 3 strides, because the room was wide and Eleanor was standing near the door, and it took him 8 full paces, each one visible to every person present, each one a public declaration written in the language of a man's body moving through a crowd that had been told to expect a different ending. He stopped in front of Eleanor. His face was cracked open now, the composure gone, the discipline gone, and what was underneath was not coldness and not pride and not the stone-carved authority the county had assigned him. It was grief, 10 years of it, and underneath the grief, something that looked like the first morning after a long winter, tentative and raw and unwilling to believe its own warmth. He took her hand. Her fingers were cold. His were warm. The contact was the simplest thing in the room and the most radical, because he had chosen it. In front of every witness who had ever called her, the companion, and the charity case, and the girl with nothing. And his choice was specific and irrevocable and public, and it could not be taken back. Miss Graves, he said, and his voice was low, and his voice was level, and his voice broke on the second syllable of her name in a way that made Mrs. Dalton press her handkerchief to her mouth. I should have found you 10 years ago. I am finding you now. Augusta opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. You cannot, she said. And the sentence was not finished, because she could not find the architecture for a sentence that would contain what was happening. And the fragments of what she had intended to say fell apart in the air between them, and for the first time in Eleanor's memory, the Dowager Duchess of Hartfield did not look formidable. She looked small. Miss Pemberton touched her father's arm. We should go, she said quietly. And there was something in her voice that was not humiliation and not anger, but a kind of recognition. The sound of a woman who has been shown, not cruelly, that the shape she was offered had always been someone else's. Lord Pemberton nodded. They departed without ceremony. The old housekeeper, Mrs. Fellows, stood in the servants' door with her hands clasped at her waist and tears running down her face in 2 straight lines, because she had been at Hartfield for 30 years, and she had carried the dowager's letters to the fire, and she had carried the guilt of it in her chest ever since, and she had added Eleanor's name to Mrs. Dalton's invitation in her own hand in January, because 30 years of obedience had finally weighed less than 1 night of possible correction. Eleanor looked at Philip. His hand was still holding hers. The crown of paper had slipped from her head at some point during the evening, and she did not know when, and she did not care. Because the man standing in front of her was looking at her the way he had looked at her 10 years ago, across a ballroom strung with holly, with the 12th night cake on the table, and the snow falling outside, and the future shining like a window lit from within. 10 years, she said. Yes. You did not write to me. I wrote 3 times. The letters did not reach you. The truth of it settled between them like snow settling on a sill, quiet and weightless, and changing the color of everything it touched, and Eleanor's breath caught, and her hand in his tightened, and she understood in a single moment what the silence had been. Not rejection, and not indifference, and not the confirmation of her worst belief about herself, but a door held shut by someone who had believed she had the authority to hold it. She looked at Augusta. The dowager had not moved from her chair. Her hands were in her lap. Her garnets caught the candlelight. She did not meet Eleanor's eyes, and in the quality of her avoidance, there was something that was not apology. Because Augusta would never apologize, but was perhaps the first faint tremor of a woman who has realized that the order she spent her life defending has produced a result she did not intend. The crowd dispersed. Carriages were called. The musicians had long since packed their instruments. The servants moved through the ballroom collecting glasses and plates and the remnants of the 12th night cake, and the candles burned lower, and the holly garlands cast long shadows across the empty chairs, and the house settled into the particular hush of a great room slowly returning to itself. Eleanor and Philip stood in the small library where the poetry books lived, and the fire had been kept burning, and the snow pressed against the windows like a visitor asking to be let in. He had not released her hand. She had not asked him to. The dance card lay on the table between the green volume of verse and a guttering candle, her name in his handwriting repeated down every line, and she looked at it and looked at him, and understood that some things, once kept, cannot be returned to the place where they were found, because the keeping has changed them into something else entirely. I did not marry, she said. There was no gentleman in Dorset. There was no offer. I know that now. I thought you did not want me. I have wanted nothing else. The fire shifted. A log settled. The sound was small and domestic and ordinary, and it was the most beautiful sound Eleanor had heard in 10 years, because it was the sound of a house in which she was no longer a guest, and no longer a companion, and no longer the girl the season had decided to forget. The sound of a room that intended to keep her. He reached into the breast pocket of his coat and produced a small folded paper, creased and worn, and set it beside the dance card on the table. A letter. The first of the 3 he had written, the one that had said duty and care, and I would consider it a privilege, retrieved from the dowager's writing desk the previous week by Mrs. Fellows, who had found it wedged beneath a drawer, lining where the fire had failed to reach it. 1 letter, out of 3. Enough. Outside, the snow was falling on Hartfield in the way that snow falls on a house that has finally decided what it is for, steady and soft and unhurried, covering the garden and the drive and the stone bench beneath the oak where Eleanor had sat at 17, and read poetry, while the future assembled itself around her in shapes she could not yet see. The holly wreath on the front door wore a cap of white. The last carriage had gone. The 12th night was over, and Epiphany had begun. And inside the small library the fire burned, and the dance card lay open on the table, and Eleanor Graves sat in the chair nearest the window, with her hand in Philip Ashworth's hand, and the paper crown on the mantelpiece behind them, crooked and gilded and absurd and kept. Thank you for staying until the end of Eleanor's story. If her 10 years of silence moved you, leave a quiet word before you go. She would have wanted someone to hear.